Have you ever seen a tank strapped with rusty bed springs? In 1944, when the Germans saw this, they literally fell over laughing. They called the Soviet machines a gypsy caravan and anticipated easy prey, and their own commanders threatened the inventor with execution for damaging government property. But within 24 hours, the laughter turned to primal terror. The German superguns proved powerless, and their defenses were torn to shreds. How did garbage from a dump turn out to be stronger than the thickest armor? Why did they want to court-martial a man for bedspring protection, only to later hand him medals? And what kind of terrifying physics turned tanks without this protection into steel crematoriums in a second? Watch to the end. The story of this dirty invention turned the tide of the war and is saving soldiers' lives even in the 21st century. Number 312 doesn't explode. It just chokes on fire. First, you hear a dry, nasty cracking sound, like a giant dead branch snapping. Then comes a hissing that sets your teeth on edge. It's not the sound of a solid slug hitting steel. It is the sound of a shaped charge jet, heated to thousands of degrees, passing through frontal armor like a hot needle through wax. No ricochet, no ringing, just the physics of destruction. The turret hatch flies off, clanging against the cobblestones. A column of thick, black smoke erupts from the opening. Inside the tank, it is hell right now. The temperature spikes instantly. The ammunition detonates in 2 seconds. The multi-ton turret jumps like a lid on a boiling pot and crashes onto its side with a roar, crushing the fender. The smell of burnt rubber mixes with a heavy, sweetish odor that every tanker knows. That is the smell of burnt organic matter. The crew didn't even have time to realize they were dead. The driver mechanic was likely still gripping the levers when the jet turned the fighting compartment into a crematorium. Ternopil, April 1944. The narrow streets of the old city had become a stone trap, a labyrinth where death sat around every corner, in every basement, behind every pile of bricks. There was no room to maneuver here. The speed of the T-34 was useless here. Here, the combat distance had shrunk to the throw of a grenade. Tanks created for maneuvering in the steppes had turned into clumsy targets here. Huge, blind, doomed. Captain Volkov stands in cover, pressing his back against the cold brick of a half-ruined wall. He looks at the burning carcass of number 312. His face is gray with dust and soot. His hands, gripping a map case, are trembling slightly. This isn't fear. It's rage born of powerlessness. He shifts his gaze to his men. The survivors are squatting along the wall, smoking greedily, hiding the glowing tips in their sleeves. Everyone has the same eyes, the empty, glassy eyes of men who have looked over the edge. The statistics are dry and merciless, like a tribunal's sentence. In 5 days of fighting, the company has lost 12 machines, 37 personnel, 37 trained specialists, mechanics, gunners, commanders. Now they are just numbers in casualty notices. And they all have the same cause. Not the heavy German Tigers, not anti-tank guns. No. The cause is a rusty pipe held in the hands of any Wehrmacht infantryman. The Panzerfaust. Cheap, stamped metal. Primitive, ugly, disposable. But in the conditions of urban combat, it is absolute evil. The shaped charge doesn't penetrate armor with kinetic energy. It doesn't care about the thickness of the steel. It doesn't care about the slope angle the designers of the T-34 were so proud of. Upon impact, the explosive forms a thin jet of gases and molten metal. The pressure at the point of contact is millions of atmospheres. The armor simply flows. The jet bursts inside, spraying drops of metal, burning up the oxygen, igniting fuel and oil, tearing through flesh. 12, Volkov says hoarsely, not looking at anyone. 12 boxes in a week. Nearby, a loader from the second platoon spits on the ground. His hands are wrapped in rags, burns from shell casings. Comrade Captain, we won't make it to the center like this. We won't even make it to the next intersection. They're burning us like matches. From every crack. You don't see him, but he has you in his sights. A pop, and that's it. Say goodbye to the family. Volkov turns sharply. Cut the panic. It's not panic. Lieutenant Samoylov, the commander of the only surviving tank in the first platoon, answers hollowly. He is sitting on an ammo crate, wiping his face, black with oil, with a rag. It's arithmetic.
They have warehouses full of these Fausts.
And our armor is like cardboard. They hit us in the front, they hit us in the side. Yesterday they burned Mishka Sedov with a shot from above, from the 3rd floor. The jet went through the roof, stitched through the engine. The tank stalled, and then they hit it a second time. What can we do? Maneuver with armor? In this stone sack? The captain is silent. He has nothing to answer. He knows the lieutenant is right. Headquarters demands the pace of the offensive be maintained. They demand the Germans be driven out of the center of Ternopil. But how do you fight ghosts? The tank is blind. The vision slits give a narrow sector of view. The infantry riders don't always manage to clear every basement. One shot from a Panzerfaust costs pennies in Reichsmarks. A T-34 tank costs 200,000 rubles and thousands of man-hours of labor. An unequal exchange. The economics of war are working against them. Volkov looks at the map of the city. Red arrows butt against the black squares of city blocks. Each block has to be taken with blood. The tankers are afraid to get into their machines. It is the physiology of fear. When you sit inside a steel box, you realize you are separated from death by only 45 millimeters of steel that no longer protects you. You wait for the sound of the impact. You listen to every rustle outside. You know that if it hits, you won't even have time to open the hatch. One more day of fighting like this and the company will be disbanded, Volkov says quietly. Or we'll all be written off as irreversible losses. We need a solution. Not heroism, damn it. We have enough heroism. Look, the hospitals are full of heroes. We need the tanks to live, to take a hit. Take it with what? Samoylov snaps. Weld on more armor. The engine won't pull it, the transmission will blow. Cover ourselves with sandbags. They fly off from the vibration of the first cannon shot. Tie logs to it. They burn. A heavy, sticky silence hangs in the air. The only sound is a machine gun working somewhere on the next street in short, angry bursts. And again, an explosion booms, a dull, guttural sound of detonation in an enclosed space. Another Faust grenade has found a target. Volkov clenches his fists until his knuckles turn white. He feels like a traitor. He is sending men to their deaths, knowing they have no chance. This isn't a war of motors. It's a slaughter. German infantry, armed with disposable tubes, is outplaying the Soviet tank industry on the narrow streets of the old city. A way out is needed. Immediately. Now. Otherwise, by morning, all that will remain of the company will be smoking pyres at the intersections of Ternopil and a list of names for the burial detail. The theory of armored warfare didn't work here. Manuals written in the blood of 1941 had become useless waste paper here, in 1944, in the face of a new threat. The shaped charge jet laughed at sloped armor. It didn't care. The captain kicked a piece of brick. Think, he threw into the void. If you want to live, think. Your head isn't just for wearing a helmet. Senior Sergeant Dmitry Orlov didn't smoke. He stood near a knocked-out T-34 with the hull number 208 and ran his finger along the edges of the hole. The metal here was melted, as if someone had poked the armor with a giant soldering iron. The hole was small, slightly larger than a 5-kopeck coin. Neat. Deadly. Around it were splashes of solidified steel, looking like frozen drops of mercury. Orlov was a mechanic to the marrow of his bones. Before the war, he rebuilt tractor engines at a machine tractor station, and to him, any mechanism was an understandable organism. But here, facing this hole, he saw not just damage, he saw a principle of operation. He took a wrench out of his pocket and placed it against the armor. He thought. "Too close," he muttered under his breath. "The whole trick is in the distance." Nearby, sitting on the track, turret gunner Popov was wiping his hands with a rag. He looked at the sergeant major with tired indifference. "What are you looking at there, Dmitrich? It's a hole like any other, right through. Vitka was killed instantly, didn't even have time to squeak." "Not just a hole." Orlov didn't turn around. "It's a lens. The Germans focused the fire into a point, like we used to burn ants with a magnifying glass as kids. The sun warms everyone, but if you gather the beam into a bundle, paper burns. Same here. The explosive in the grenade won't take the armor by itself. But if you compress the explosion into a needle, it cuts us like butter." Orlov picked up a piece of wire from the ground and shoved it into the hole. The wire went deep, clinking against the breech of the gun inside. "So, what does that mean?" He continued his thought, looking at the blackened metal. "It means the power of this junk is in concentration. The jet forms right here, on the nose of the grenade. It needs to brace against something solid to work. It hits, burns through, and flies inside." He stepped back from the tank, squinting. Gears were turning in his head, fitting one thing to another. If the grenade explodes on the armor, the crew are corpses. That is an axiom. But what if the grenade explodes sooner? 30 centimeters, Orlov said loudly. Popov raised his head. 30 what? Empty space, Vanya. We need 30 centimeters of empty space. The mechanic walked over to a pile of debris by the wall of a destroyed workshop. He kicked a rusty iron bed frame.
Then he picked up a piece of rebar.
"Look, if this bastard hits not the armor, but an obstacle in front of it." Orlov began sketching a diagram on the dusty side of the tank with his wrench. "Here's the armor. Here's the screen. The grenade hits the screen. The fuse triggers. The jet bursts out. But it still has to fly through the air to get to the armor. The air will splash it. It will lose focus. The temperature will drop. By the time it gets to the armor, it won't be a needle, just a hot gob of spit. It'll scratch the paint, but it won't go inside." 2 other tankers from the 3rd crew walked up to them. They listened silently, chuckling skeptically. "You proposing we weld beds to the tank, Sergeant Major?" One of them, a young guy with a bandaged head, smirked crookedly. "The Germans will die of laughter? A gypsy caravan, not a tank company." "Let them laugh," Orlov cut him off harshly. His voice became dry and raspy, like an ungreased hinge. "The main thing is that they don't shoot. Or let them shoot, but for nothing. You, Petrov, did you see how number 105 burned yesterday? Did you see Kolka screaming when he couldn't open the hatch?" The guy averted his eyes. The smirk slid off his face instantly. "I saw it." "There you go. I don't give a damn what it looks like. Wrap it in featherbeds if it saves lives. But featherbeds will burn. Steel won't." Orlov returned to his diagram. He wasn't a genius designer from a Moscow bureau. He didn't know formulas of gas dynamics or calculations of shaped charge jet density. He was a practitioner. He felt metal with his hands. He knew that a weld holds stronger than a bolt if you lay it right, and he knew that any force has a limit. "We need mesh," he reasoned aloud, no longer paying attention to the soldiers. "A solid sheet is heavy, it'll block the view, and where would we get that much anyway? But mesh is light. The grenade pokes it with the fuse, it triggers.
The jet will tear the mesh itself, but it will lose energy. It will scatter." He turned to Popov. In the mechanic's eyes, there was no longer that doomed emptiness the others had. A cold light of calculation burned there. "Find a welder, Vanya. Find electrodes. Everything there is. The company commander won't allow unauthorized modifications," Popov doubted, standing up. "He'll say we're damaging government property. Violation of regulations." "I'll talk to the commander." Orlov spat black saliva. "The property is already damaged when it has holes right through it. We're going to try to darn it." He looked at the hole again. In this small opening lay all the injustice of this war. The technological superiority of a cheap German tube over an expensive Soviet machine. Orlov hated this injustice. He wanted to fix it. Not for Stalin, not for the victory of the world proletariat, but so that tomorrow, when they crawled back into this stone hell, he would have a chance to come back alive. 30 centimeters, he repeated like a mantra. Frame made of angle iron, mesh inside, mounted on the flanks and the turret, standoff distance, physics of a spaced explosion. Lieutenant Samoylov, walking up, heard the last words. "You're awfully smart, Orlov," the officer said wearily. "You think the engineers at the factories are fools? If this worked, they would have done it long ago." "The engineers at the factories are sitting in clean offices, Comrade Lieutenant, and we are here in grease and blood. They can't see the jet eating the metal, but I can see it." Orlov straightened up, wiping his hands on his pants. "Permission to try? On my machine. It won't be any worse. It's in repair anyway. If it doesn't work, well, then that's fate. But if it works..." Samoylov looked at the determined, soot-smeared face of the sergeant major. He looked at his downcast men. They needed hope. Any hope. Even one as crazy as welding iron trash to a tank. "Do it," the lieutenant nodded. "But if the machine isn't ready for combat by morning, you're going to a penal battalion for sabotage." "It will be ready by morning," Orlov said firmly. "Either it will be ready, or I won't care anymore." This wasn't just an idea. It was a challenge to death, which lurked in the basements of Ternopil. Orlov understood. Hoping for a miracle is stupid. You could only rely on iron and on the fact that he had correctly guessed the nature of the German fire. The welding machine would become their weapon for this night, and the battlefield would narrow to the size of an open-air repair shop. The theory was beautiful, elegant. 30 centimeters of air that were supposed to absorb the fury of thousands of degrees. But paper and blueprints on armor are one thing. Reality is another. Only a German grenade flying into the flank would verify his calculations. And that moment of verification was inevitable, like the sunrise. The permission was short, like a gunshot. Captain Volkov gave no extra rations, no men, no guarantees. He gave only time. One night. If number 341 didn't roll out to position ready for battle by dawn, the experiment was over, and the company faced disbandment and the transfer of surviving crews to the infantry. For a tank company, that meant death. Infantry in urban combat lives an average of 3 attacks. The fever began. Iron fever. Orlov and Popov, taking 2 loaders with them, went not to the ammo depot, but to the junkyard of history, a bombed-out residential block. They needed metal. Any metal. Bent, rusty, painted in the cheerful colors of peaceful life, war didn't care what it smelted down. They found what they were looking for in the ruins of a former workers' dormitory. Iron beds, dozens of armored bed meshes buried under brick and plaster. It looked wild. Soldiers in oily coveralls, cursing and tearing off their fingernails, ripping bed frames out from under the rubble. What people had slept on a month ago was now supposed to stop cumulative death. The logistics of desperation, hauling rusty frames on your back under the whistle of stray bullets, gasping for breath, tasting lime dust on your teeth. The weight of one such section was about 15 kilograms. To protect the side, you needed 6. For the turret, another 4, plus angle irons, plus rebar for mounting. A ton of extra weight gathered from pieces of dirt. The base was located in the semi-ruined workshop of a brick factory. It smelled of dampness and carbide. The generator sputtered, choking on the load. Orlov put on a mask. The world narrowed for him to a thin slit of dark glass in which a blinding electric arc danced. Welding is not just joining two pieces of metal. It is armored vehicle surgery. The seam must be continuous, thick, reliable. Orlov welded like he had never welded in his life. He understood. If this chicken coop fell off from vibration while moving, the crew would be left naked before the German grenadiers. The sergeant major's hand was steady, though his muscles ached with fatigue. "Electrode!" he barked shortly. Popov immediately placed a new rod into the holder. No unnecessary words, no smoke breaks. The thunder of hammers drowned out the distant cannonade on the front line. Clanging, clattering, the screech of an angle grinder carving fountains of sparks. It was the symphony of a repair battalion. Men worked like they were possessed. They cut angle irons into brackets. The length of a bracket was exactly 30 centimeters. This number became sacred to them.
Less, and the jet would reach the armor. More, and the structure would be ripped off by the first building corner. Orlov welded the brackets directly to the armored hull. It was barbarism toward the factory paint and tempering, but there was no choice. First the vertical posts, then the horizontal crossbars. A rough, ugly lattice emerged. Onto it, they welded the bed meshes. A heavy, bluish smoke hung in the workshop. There was no ventilation. Eyes watered from the acrid gas of burning electrode flux, but no one stopped. The soldiers' faces became red, inflamed, covered in soot. They resembled devils in the forge of the underworld. But in this hellish work, confidence was born. "Hold it tighter, it warped!" Popov yelled, leaning his whole weight on a glowing angle iron. The metal resisted, bent, but the cooling seam seized it tightly to the tank's flank. With every hour, the T-34 changed its appearance. The sleek, swift lines the designers were so proud of vanished. The machine grew a rough, clumsy exoskeleton. It became wider, more angular. The turret turned into a basket. The flanks were covered by screens looking like prison bars. This was no longer a breakthrough tank. It was an armored beast dressed in homemade chainmail for a brawl in a back alley. At 4 in the morning, work stopped. The electrodes ran out. Orlov took off his mask. White circles remained around his eyes on his face. The rest of his skin was black with soot. He walked around the tank, struck the side screen with a sledgehammer. The structure hummed, but didn't budge. The vibration went into the hull. "It holds," he stated hoarsely. Volkov walked up. The captain hadn't slept that night, coordinating the perimeter defense, but now he found time to look into the workshop. He silently looked at the monster created by his men. The tank looked frightening, menacing and pathetic at the same time. Against the smooth armor, these rusty meshes looked like a beggar's rags, but the captain saw in this not ugliness, but a chance.
Looks like a gypsy wagon, Volkov noted, but there was no mockery in his voice. Do you want it to look pretty, or do you want it to work, comrade captain? Orlov snapped, wiping sweat with a dirty sleeve. The mesh is springy, steel is tough. It should work. Volkov stepped closer, touched the rough weld seam. He felt the heat radiating from the metal. The tank was hot, as if it had a fever. Is the crew ready? Yes, sir. We are all volunteers. Volunteers. The captain shook his head. You understand you're going out as live bait. We can't test this on a range. The range is Hill 185. An SS battalion is sitting there, and they have these Fausts like dirt. Orlov looked at his machine. Now it was his fortress, or his coffin. We understand. Theory without practice is dead, and practice without theory is blind. We'll open their eyes. Good. Volkov turned sharply. Move out in 1 hour.
Full fuel, full ammo, and...
Orlov. Me? If you burn, I'll write that you died heroes. But better not to burn. I need mechanics, not heroes. Orlov nodded. He wasn't looking for glory. He was looking for a way to survive where survival was impossible. Fatigue pressed down like a granite slab. His legs trembled. His ears rang. But there was no fear. Work had displaced fear. They had done everything they could. They had changed the machine's design against all instructions. Now the word belonged to the German rocket grenade. Dawn over Ternopil was gray and smoky. Tank number 341, tracks clanking, crawled out of the workshop. The iron meshes on the flanks vibrated slightly in time with the diesel engine. The machine seemed heavier, squat. It resembled a gladiator who had put on everything he found at hand before stepping into the arena. On the back, on the armor, sat Popov, smoking, looking at the ruins floating by.
He knew that in half an hour, these meshes would either save their lives or become useless scrap metal on their mass grave. Engineering thought, born in mud and despair, was preparing to take its main exam. The examiner was death, and it didn't give grades. It just took away. The hatch slammed shut with a heavy, solid sound, cutting off the spring morning. Inside the tank, the familiar gloom descended, diluted only by the dim light of a bulb and the greenish glow of the periscopes. The world narrowed to the size of the fighting compartment. Now their universe smelled of diesel, gunpowder fumes, and the sour sweat of 4 men who had voluntarily agreed to become targets. Hill 185 towered over the block like a layer cake of broken brick and concrete. The Germans were dug in tight. Intelligence reported every basement, every attic was a firing point. It was an ideal range for suicide. It was there, into this hornet's nest, that number 341 was crawling. Orlov engaged the gear. The levers moved stiffly. The tank jerked and, tracks clanking, began the ascent up the debris-cluttered street. Speed, minimal. This was part of the plan. They weren't charging. They weren't trying to break through with speed, using maneuvers. They were moving like they were on parade. Slowly, leisurely, provocatively. Keep it steady, Dmitrich. Lieutenant Samoylov, the gun commander who had taken the place in the turret instead of the regular commander, wheezed into the throat mic. Don't jerk. Let them get a good look at us. This phrase sounded like a sentence. The crew's task contradicted everything they had been taught in tank schools. The instinct of self-preservation screamed, "Gas! Maneuver! Hide behind the smoke!" But the order was different.
Expose yourself. Provoke. Force the enemy to pull the trigger. Orlov felt a cold trickle of sweat running down his back under his coveralls. His hands on the levers were wet, slippery. He wiped them on his pant leg one by one without letting go of the controls. Inside the tank was the roar of the engine, but for the crew, silence existed now. That special, ringing silence of expectation when you know that dozens of eyes are watching you through sights. Somewhere out there, behind the thickness of brick walls, German tank hunters were already hoisting their tubes onto their shoulders. They saw the strange Russian machine. It looked ridiculous with those bedsprings on the flanks. They must be laughing. Easy prey, slow target. The distance was closing. 200 meters, 150, 100. "Turret, right 15, high explosive," commanded Samoilov. "Make some noise for them. Let them wake up." Popov shoved a shell into the breach. The shutter clanged like a guillotine. "Ready!" The shot hit their ears despite the helmets. The tank rocked. The casing fell to the floor with a ring. Ahead, in a second-floor window of a semi-ruined house, a cloud of dust billowed. It was a challenge. They were practically shouting, "We are here! Shoot!" Waiting for the impact is the worst torture for a tanker. You don't see the grenade's flight. You don't hear the whistle. You just sit in a closed volume surrounded by mechanisms, fuel, and shells, and wait for the steel around you to turn into plasma. Every second stretched into eternity. Inhale, we are still alive. Exhale, still alive. "Movement spotted!" shouted the radio operator machine gunner, glued to the hull machine gun. "Reference point 2, ruins of the store. Faustman!" Orlov's heart skipped a beat. This is it, the moment of truth. Right now, that faceless German in a gray greatcoat will press the lever. Now the ejection charge will trigger. The grenade, looking like a potato masher, will fly in an arc. It has a second of flight, maybe 1.5. "Hold fire!" Samoilov's harsh voice cut through the rushing blood in their ears. "Let him hit. We wait." It was madness. To sit and watch yourself be killed. Orlov gripped the levers until his fingers turned white. He wanted to jerk the machine to the left, get behind a pile of slabs, save himself. But he held the course, straight, exposing the flank covered by a rusty bedspring mesh on which, perhaps recently, a child had slept. Now their lives depended not on the thickness of armor, not on the driver's skill, but on simple physical laws and the quality of welding done at night by trembling hands. 30 centimeters of air. Would it be enough? And what if the mesh breaks too early? And what if the grenade goes between the bars? And what if the theory is a madman's delusion and they are about to burn alive like the crew of 105 yesterday? Pictures flashed in his head. Flash, fire, jammed hatches. Orlov knew these pictures by heart. He had seen them too often. Fear twisted his stomach into a tight knot. His mouth was so dry his tongue felt like sandpaper. "Come on then, you bastard," he whispered. "Come on." They were bait. Fat, steel bait in an iron cage. And the predator bit. The flash of the shot from the alleyway was barely noticeable in the dust, but Orlov felt the moment with his skin. Time stopped. It seemed he could hear the rustle of the grenade's fins. The crew froze. 4 men in an iron box stopped breathing. They couldn't do anything. They could only believe. Believe in Orlov, in the weld, in physics. This wasn't heroism in the bookish sense. There were no beautiful poses or flags here. Here were only sweaty, dirty men locked in a tin can, who had voluntarily driven to an execution, hoping the executioner's axe would break on their homemade shield. The engine roar seemed deafening. Orlov's gaze was riveted to the vision slit. He saw only gray bricks and pieces of rebar. But he knew death was already on its way.
It had already separated from the launch tube and was flying toward the right flank, straight into the center of the homemade screen.
"Brace yourselves!" yelled Samoylov, though there was nothing to brace against. 1 second. Another. The waiting tore at their nerves. It seemed the air inside the tank was electrified. The smell of fear became almost tangible. No one prayed. There are no atheists in war, but in a tank, God is armor, and right now their God was made of scrap metal. Orlov squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, expecting heat, that same infernal heat that turns a tank into a mass grave. He didn't want to die, but even more, he didn't want to watch his comrades burn. The decision was made. The bets were placed. The iron cages of Ternopil were entering the game. The impact wasn't like what they expected. Instead of the disgusting crunch of tearing armor and the subsequent hissing, the tank's hull shuddered from a booming, ringing strike. As if a giant had swung a blacksmith's hammer onto an empty barrel. The sound was dry, harsh, but not fatal. It didn't have the viscous heaviness of penetration, but the vibration of a ricochet. Inside the turret, scale and ancient dust rained down from the ceiling. Orlov instinctively pulled his head into his shoulders, expecting a wave of fire. He squeezed his eyes shut, counting fractions of a second. 1, 2, 3. The temperature in the fighting compartment didn't change. No smell of burnt meat, no howl of flames. Only the smell of burnt gunpowder seeping in from outside, and the heavy scent of ozone, like after a close lightning strike. "Alive?" Lieutenant Samoylov's voice in the headphones sounded strange, as if he were speaking through cotton. "Engine normal," Orlov responded automatically. His hands checked the gauges on their own. Oil pressure, normal. Water temperature, normal. RPMS, stable. The tank wasn't burning. Outside, physics was happening that no one fully believed in. The German grenade hit the bedspring mesh. The sensitive piezoelectric fuse triggered instantly upon meeting the resistance of steel wire. The charge detonated. The shaped charge cone collapsed, birthing that very jet, a thin needle of hypersonic plasma. But it didn't happen on the armor. It happened 30 centimeters away from it. The jet, designed to burn through steel at point-blank range, burst into emptiness, into air. It had nothing to bite into. Having no solid medium for focusing, the red-hot stream of gases and molten copper began to lose density. It flew those cursed 30 centimeters, splashing like a stream of water from a fire hose hitting a stone. The mesh snapped, flew into shreds. The frame was torn out with chunks of metal. But this junk had done its job. Reaching the main armor of the T-34 was no longer a needle, but a hot, unfocused splat. It struck the flank, burned the paint, left a black soot spot and a shallow gouge, but spread impotently over the tempered steel. Energy capable of burning through half a meter of iron went into heating the atmosphere of a Ternopil street. "They didn't understand," Popov yelled, glued to the periscope. "The Fritzes didn't understand. They're looking and they don't believe it." The Germans were indeed dumbfounded. By their calculations, the Russian tank should have turned into a torch. But the machine continued to crawl, jerking its barrel, alive and unharmed. This hesitation lasted a few seconds, and then hell began. The enemy decided to correct the mistake with quantity. The second strike hit the turret. Again, that booming, bell-like ring that blocked their ears. The tank rocked. Third strike, to the rear, on the engine deck grill. Fourth. It was like beating an infant. The tank shuddered, creaked, groaned with its whole metallic body. Outside, sparks flew. Pieces of rebar, scraps of wire. The screens were being torn to shreds. Number 341 was turning into a pile of moving scrap metal. But inside, with every new hit, the crew felt not fear, but a wild animal euphoria. It was the hysteria of survivors. With every blow that didn't kill them, fear left, giving way to angry excitement. "Come on! Give us more!" the loader yelled, unable to hear himself over the din. "Choke on it, you bastards!" 8 hits. 8 direct hits with Panzerfausts from a distance of less than 50 meters. By any statistics, by any manuals of the Wehrmacht and the Red Army, this tank should have been destroyed 8 times. But it kept working. "Orlov, reverse! Pull back!" Samoylov commanded. "Experiment over! We'll be left without screens in a second! Naked!" Orlov yanked the levers toward himself. The tank roared, threw out a cloud of blue smoke, and began backing up into cover, behind the saving wall of the brick factory. It retreated not like a beaten dog, but like a bear stung by bees, angry, snapping back with fire from the Hull machine gun. When they drove around the corner and the engine died, silence fell. That specific, ringing silence after combat, when you can hear metal cooling and blood pounding in your temples. The hatch opened with difficulty. It was slightly warped from the blast wave. Popov climbed out first. He jumped to the ground, his legs gave way, and he sat right in the mud. He took off his helmet. His hands were shaking so much he couldn't get a cigarette out. Orlov climbed out next. He was soaked through, his coveralls sticking to his back. He walked around the tank. The sight was gruesome. Of the neat frames and meshes, only memories remained. The flanks were entangled in torn wire, broken angle irons stuck out. Everything was black with soot. The tank looked like it had gone through a meat grinder. Orlov walked up to the right flank. Where shiny green paint used to be, now 8 ugly spots blackened the surface. He ran his hand over one of them. The metal was still hot, burning his fingers. In the center of the spot was a dent a centimeter deep, and that was it. No through hole, no cracks. "She's whole," he whispered. His voice cracked. "Whole, baby." People were already running toward them. Captain Volkov, soldiers from the repair platoon, infantry. They looked at the mangled machine with horror, expecting to see corpses inside. But when they saw the living crew standing nearby, smoking with shaking hands, the crowd froze. Volkov walked up to Orlov. The captain was pale. He had seen the Faust men shooting the machine at point-blank range. He had mentally buried this crew already. "Report," he demanded, trying to return statutory firmness to his voice. Orlov straightened up. On his face, black with soot, only the whites of his eyes and teeth shone in the mad smile of a man who had just returned from the other side. "Comrade Captain, tank T-34, hull number 341. 8 direct hits with shaped charge grenades. Armor penetrations, none. Crew casualties, none. Vehicle combat capable." Volkov shifted his gaze to the side of the tank, to those black pock marks, then to the torn remains of the bedspring mesh lying in the mud. He understood. Everyone understood. "So, it works," the captain said quietly. "Your arithmetic works, Sergeant." Popov suddenly laughed. It was a nervous, barking laugh that turned into a cough. "They shot at us with beds. We beat them off with beds. With beds!" The tension snapped. Soldiers around began to smile, clapping the tankers on the shoulders. Someone held out a flask. But Orlov didn't laugh. He looked at his hands. He only now realized that his theory, sketched with a wrench on dusty armor, had saved their lives. It wasn't magic. It was the victory of engineering arrogance over death. 30 centimeters of air turned out to be stronger than the thickest steel.
Vanya,
Orlov turned to Popov.
bring the welder and electrodes. What for, Dmitrich? We need to rest. What the hell kind of rest?
The sergeant major's eyes flashed hard.
We have 14 more machines in the company, and the night is ahead. Tomorrow the Germans will come to their senses. We need to get everyone dressed.
The triumph of the moment passed. Work remained. Dirty, hard work to save lives. Orlov understood. Today they got lucky. They were first. Tomorrow the element of surprise would vanish. But now they had technology. They had a shield. And this shield had to be forged for everyone who would go to storm the center of Ternopil tomorrow. Inspection of the machine showed that, apart from torn screens and broken headlights, there was no damage. Engine, transmission, gun, everything worked. The shaped charge jet, that absolute weapon of close combat, had been neutralized by garbage from a dump. The physics of spaced armor, written about in smart books but feared in practice, had proved its right to exist with blood and sweat. Or rather, with the absence of blood.
Didn't believe it?
Orlov grumbled, picking up a piece of a melted German grenade from the ground.
You should have. Iron, it doesn't lie. People lie when they're afraid.
He threw the piece of metal toward the ruins. Now he knew for sure. This city could be taken. And they would take it. Not with meat, but with brains. And welding. The rumor that the crew of 341 had returned from hell without a single scratch flew through the company's location faster than shrapnel. This wasn't an official report. It was a whisper, passed from mechanic to mechanic, from loader to gunner. Soldiers walked up to Orlov's machine, touched the sooty, torn remains of the meshes, stuck fingers into the black spots on the armor, and stayed silent. They saw the proof. Death, which seemed inevitable, had retreated before a piece of rusty wire. Captain Volkov didn't call a meeting. He just gathered the crew commanders in a semi-dark corner of the workshop, where a map of the city was laid out on crates. "You saw Orlov's machine." The company commander's voice was raspy from insomnia. "It works. We have 15 tanks. By morning, all 15 must be shielded." "Comrade Captain," a lieutenant from the 2nd platoon objected. "Where will we get that much metal? We have no materials. The repair battalion is empty." "The city is big." Volkov swept his hand around the space. "Ternopil will help us. Clear the rubble. Drag everything. Fences, gates, window grills, beds from apartments." "I don't give a damn what it is. The main thing is to keep the 30-centimeter distance. Get to it." And the night ceased to be a time for rest. The night turned into a work shift in hell. The company turned into a guild of junk dealers. Crews, instead of sleeping before battle, scattered through the surrounding ruins. Tankers, cursing in the dark, pried iron park fences with crowbars, tore forged gates off hinges at merchant mansions, pulled spring mattresses out from under the wreckage of houses. Everything went into action. War had canceled the concept of private property and aesthetics. Only the expediency of survival remained. The brick factory workshop, which had become the base, filled with a roar that shook the surviving glass under the ceiling. 15 multi-ton machines stood in a row, like huge beasts in a stall, and feverish work boiled around each one. Orlov was everywhere. He no longer belonged to his crew. He became the chief engineer of this insane night assembly line. He ran from tank to tank, stepping over cables, oxygen tanks, and piles of iron. "Don't weld solid!" he yelled at a young sergeant who was trying to weld an angle iron to a turret. "You'll soften the armor. Do it with tacks. Tacks! 5-centimeter seam." "Sergeant, the electrodes are sticking," the sergeant snapped back, chipping off slag. "Add more current, and clean it better. There's 3 layers of paint here." The air in the workshop became dense, almost solid. No ventilation. Blue smoke from welding, the smell of carbide, gasoline, and sweat ate at the eyes. Men worked without masks. There weren't enough. They looked at the arc through smoked glass, through slits in cardboard, simply squinting and turning away at the last moment. By morning, everyone would have welder's flash in their eyes, red, inflamed eyelids, as if sand had been poured in them. But that would be later. Right now, the fear of being left naked before a German Panzerfaust was stronger than the pain. It was a strange picture. Men who were supposed to kill and die tomorrow were creating right now. They were building their protection. The fear that had paralyzed them for the last few days was replaced by angry, working excitement. A goal appeared. Technology appeared. The hammering drowned out thoughts of death. "Dmitrich, look!" shouted the mechanic of 108. "I ran out of mesh. I tacked on a sewer grate. Will it work?" Orlov ran over, punched the massive cast-iron grate welded onto brackets. "Heavy, damn it! But it'll work. Cast iron is brittle. Shards will slash infantry if they're nearby. But it'll break up the jet. Leave it." In the far corner, crews of the 3rd Platoon were cutting steel strips with an oxy-fuel torch. A sheaf of sparks hit the wall, illuminating sweaty black faces. It seemed orcs were forging weapons in a dungeon here, not Soviet tanks being repaired. But in this chaos, there was iron order. No one sat idle. Loaders hauled iron, gunners marked welding spots with chalk, commanders held parts while welders laid seams. Logistics were primitive, but effective. Electrodes ran out. Soldiers were sent to the repairmen in the rear, trading captured schnapps and canned meat for 2 packs of number 4 rods. Oxygen ran out. They rolled tanks from a bombed hospital. The time deficit spurred them better than any commissar. 3 hours remained until dawn. 2. 1. The tanks changed before their eyes. They lost their factory regulation look. They became ugly, hunchbacked, bristling. One flank covered with a bedspring mesh, the other with a wrought iron fence with scrolls, the turret girdled with a rebar frame. It was a parade of technical grotesque. But in this ugliness lay hidden animal power. These were machines ready to eat fire. By 4 in the morning, the roar in the workshop began to subside. One by one, the machines went dark. Only the ringing of metal cooling after welding and the heavy breathing of men could be heard. Soldiers were dropping from fatigue. They sat on tracks, on crates, right on the floor, dirty, burned by sparks, with black circles under their eyes. But they were smiling. They looked at their machines not as doomed coffins, but as fortresses. Orlov walked along the line. He swayed with fatigue. His hands, which had held the stinger all night, trembled with a fine tremor. He inspected every tank, checked the seams, tugged on the meshes. "Good," he said quietly, but in the silence of the workshop, everyone heard him. "Now we'll fight." Captain Volkov walked out to the center. He was clean-shaven, trim, as if he hadn't spent the night amidst smoke and soot. He ran his gaze along the line of these iron monsters in cages. "Mount up!" The command sounded sharp, like a bolt clicking. "Start engines!" The workshop filled with the roar of 15 V2 diesel engines. Blue exhaust hit the walls. The tanks, clanking tracks, moved toward the exit. The earth trembled. In the morning twilight, the column looked terrifying. It was no longer just a tank company. It was a pack of armored monsters dressed in armor that hadn't been designed in design bureaus. Orlov took his place in 341. He felt the machine with his back. Now it was almost a ton heavier. Inertia increased. Dimensions grew. But his soul was calm. He had given the men a chance. He had given them those saving 30 centimeters. The dawn of April 24th, 1944, rose over Ternopil blood red. The city was silent, lurking before the storm. The Germans on the front line were likely wiping their optics and preparing their Panzerfausts, confident that today they would again arrange a fiery bath for the Russian tanks. They didn't know the rules of the game had changed that night. The column crawled out to the starting positions. The screech of tracks on cobblestones sounded like a funeral march for the enemy defense. Ahead lay the city center, dense buildings, narrow streets, hundreds of basements, an ideal trap. But today the mousetrap was supposed to break on the mouse's iron hide. "Attention all!" Volkov's voice on the air was calm and cold. "Work according to plan. Keep distance. Don't cut off the infantry. And remember, your armor now is not just steel. It is your work. Forward!" The engine roared, gaining RPMs. Orlov engaged second gear. The tank jerked from its spot, crushing a pile of broken brick. Ahead was the unknown, but now it didn't scare them like yesterday. Fear had burned up in the flame of the welding arc. Only cold determination remained to test the new armor in mass combat. The morning attack promised to be brutal, and the monsters born in the night shift were to be the first violins in it. The morning of April 24th began not with artillery preparation, but with the roar of motors. The ground trembled, transmitting vibration into the basements where German tank hunters were hiding. They waited. They were confident. For the last week, hunting Russian tanks had been a shooting gallery for them. Clumsy green boxes crawled out to the intersection, took a grenade in the side, and turned into bonfires. The Germans knew, one shot, one corpse. It was an axiom confirmed by hundreds of burned machines from Kursk to the Dnieper. But this time, something else floated out of the morning fog. The tanks advanced in a deployed line, as much as the width of the streets allowed. They looked like creations of a mad mechanic's sick mind, ugly, hunchbacked, hung with rusty junk. On the flanks hung twisted bed frames, pieces of fences, some grates. These structures shook, clanged, making the machine's silhouette blurred and indistinct. But behind this clang hid the heavy, inevitable tread of death. An Obergefreiter on the corner of Sadovaya Street let the lead machine get within 30 meters, ideal distance. He calmly raised the launch tube, aimed at the middle of the hull, where the fuel tanks were located behind the armor. Pressed the trigger. The pop of the ejection charge was drowned in the roar of battle. The grenade, its tail fins wobbling, went straight to the target. The German lowered the tube, expecting the familiar spectacle. A flash, a pillar of fire from the hatches, screams of the crew. Impact. A sheaf of sparks. And nothing. The tank didn't stop. It didn't burst into flames. The grenade hit the iron mesh, tore it to shreds, but the shaped charge jet, splashing in the air, only left a black soot spot on the armor. 341, jerking from the blow, began to slowly turn its turret toward the shooter. The muzzle brake of the gun stared straight into the stunned German's face. It was the gaze of a corpse that refused to die. "Feuer!" someone screamed hysterically in the ruins. "Warum brennt nicht?" Bullets drummed on the armor, bouncing helplessly off the steel. A second shot from the basement opposite. The grenade hit the turret, getting tangled in the rebar frame. The explosion tore the structure off, but the armor held again.
The tank, like an enraged beast shaking off an annoying insect, let out a short burst from the hull machine gun, turning the basement brickwork into crumbs. It was a psychological break. German infantry, used to equipment being the victim, suddenly found themselves facing an invulnerable enemy. The effect was akin to meeting a zombie. You shoot him in the heart, and he keeps coming. You hit him with a sledgehammer, and he just bares iron teeth. The logic of war, in which the Panzerfaust was the absolute weapon, collapsed in 1 minute. On the tank company's radio, instead of the usual panicked cries of "Burning! Goodbye, brothers!" and cursing, dry, angry reports sounded. Emotions vanished. Work remained. Cleanup work. 5, this is 8. Took a hit in the right flank. Screen torn off. Armor intact. I see the shooter. Distance 40. High explosive. Shot. 10 online. 2 hits to the rear. Great holding. Moving on. This is 2. My bed fell off. Cover me while I turn the other side. Orlov drove his machine at the lead. He no longer flinched at strikes on the hull. He got used to this sound, the sound of the enemy's impotent rage. The tank went through brick piles, crushing machine gun nests with its tracks. The meshes on the flanks were torn, hanging in rags, but they did the main thing. They stole those saving centimeters from death. The Germans ran. It wasn't a tactical retreat, it was panic. Wehrmacht soldiers, dropping useless tubes, ran through courtyards, trying to get away from these iron monsters. Fear of the charmed Russian tanks traveled faster than radio orders. Rumors that the Russians had invented magnetic protection or that they had new top-secret armor raced ahead of the advancing company. No one could believe it was all about rusty mattress springs. In one courtyard, a T-34 cornered a platoon of grenadiers in a dead end. They opened a barrage of fire from Panzerfausts. 3 grenades hit the front and sides of the machine almost simultaneously. The tank disappeared in a cloud of smoke and dust. The Germans cheered joyfully, deciding they had finally got the beast. But when the dust settled, they saw a sooty, stripped tank, looking like a pile of scrap metal, but alive, floating out of the cloud. The engine hummed evenly, spitting blue smoke. The turret turned. The Germans froze. Superstitious terror could be read in their eyes. Weapons fell from their hands. They raised their hands, surrendering not to men, but to a technology they couldn't understand and kill. By noon, Volkov's company had advanced 1.5 kilometers deep into the enemy defense. It was an unthinkable pace for street fighting. Usually, such a distance was covered in a week, losing half the force. Today, they covered it in 4 hours. There were losses. Iron tore, tracks were knocked off by mines, vision devices were shattered by bullets. 2 tanks stopped with damaged running gear. But not a single tank burned. Not a single crew perished from a shaped charge jet. At a street intersection, near a semi-ruined church, the column stopped for a short refueling. Crews climbed out of hatches. Adrenaline was fading, giving way to wild fatigue. The tankers looked at their machines and laughed. It was a strange laugh, a mix of hysteria and triumph. The tanks looked like hedgehogs that had fought dogs. Quills broken, skin muddy, but the hedgehog is alive, and the dogs are whining in the alley. Orlov walked around his 341. On the right flank, where a wrought iron park fence had been welded, a huge hole gaped. Bars as thick as a finger were chopped through, melted, and twisted into knots. But the armor behind them was pristine, save for the soot. "See that, Dmitrich?" Popov ran up, kicking the twisted metal. "It just spat it out! The jet got tangled in the grate and pfft!" A captured German officer, escorted by an infantryman, walked by. The German walked with his head down,
but passing Orlov's tank, he stopped. He raised his eyes and stared at the torn bed mesh welded to the turret. A complex range of feelings reflected on his face, from bewilderment to a professional's contempt for makeshift work. "Das ist primitiv," he muttered.
Primitive. Orlov wiped his hands with a rag, looked at the German with a heavy, tired gaze. "Primitive," he agreed calmly. "But you're going to a POW camp, and I'm driving on. Physics, it doesn't ask if it's pretty. It asks if it works." The radio operator poked out of the hatch. "Commander, Brigade HQ on the line. They don't believe the report. Demanding confirmation of 0 irreversible losses, saying it's a coding error." Volkov, sitting on the armor of the neighboring machine, smirked. He took the handset. "Birch, this is Granite. I confirm. Losses from Panzerfaust fire? None. I repeat, 0. Continuing mission execution. Out." At that moment, something changed in the very air of the war. Tankers who just yesterday felt like suicide bombers locked in steel coffins felt like masters of the battlefield again. They realized the enemy can be beaten. His absolute weapon can be broken over a knee if you apply a head and a welding machine to that knee. The myth of the German grenade launcher's invincibility was dispelled, not in Academy of Sciences offices, but here, on the dirty streets of Ternopil. Dispelled by brute force, a crowbar, and ingenuity. Zombie tanks, monster tanks, vagabond tanks continued their path to the city center, leaving behind a trail of torn grates and broken enemy will. Orlov jumped onto the armor. "Start up!" he shouted, and the others picked up the cry. The iron stream began moving again. Ahead was the last line of defense, and now they knew how to pass it. Not to die for the motherland, but to force the enemy to die for his Reich. Mesh, fence, bed, it didn't matter. What mattered was that inside, living hearts beat, and a funeral pyre did not burn. The attack of the monsters continued. Silence after battle sounds louder than cannonade. It isn't emptiness. It is the ringing tension of cooling metal. At the temporary assembly point, organized in a semi-ruined tram depot, stood the 15 machines of Captain Volkov's company. They no longer resembled regular army combat units. They looked like a pack of beaten yard dogs whose fur hung in clumps, but under that dirty fur, living, undamaged muscles rippled. Colonel Stepanov, Deputy Brigade Commander for Technical Affairs, walked along the line. He had seen a lot in 3 years of war. He had seen fields near Prokhorovka littered with burnt iron. He had seen turrets torn off by internal explosions and flown 50 meters. But he had never seen this. The tanks looked monstrous. Instead of smooth, predatory armor, a pile of torn junk. Twisted water pipes, shredded bedspring meshes, sticking out rebar rods looking like porcupine quills. All this scrap metal was black with soot. It seemed the company had passed through hell and carried a piece of it out on itself. But the colonel wasn't looking at aesthetics. He was looking at facts. Stepanov stopped near machine number 102. On the side screen, made of a wrought iron cemetery fence, gaped a melted hole the size of a fist. Rods 2 fingers thick were cut through as if by a laser. The colonel took out a handkerchief, wiped the sooty armor under the hole. Clean. On the green paint remained only a spot of scale and a dent no more than 5 millimeters deep. Death, flying at a speed of several kilometers per second, tripped over a cemetery fence and splashed helplessly, falling 30 centimeters short of the target. Behind the colonel, an adjutant scurried with a clipboard, scrupulously entering numbers into a list. 35, 36, he muttered, moving from tank to tank. 37.
38, Stepanov finished harshly, stopping at Orlov's tank. 38 direct hits on the company in one battle. This number should have meant catastrophe. By expenditure standards of combat units in urban conditions, 38 Panzerfaust hits guaranteed knocking out at least 20 machines. This would mean the complete destruction of the company and loss of initiative on the front sector. It would mean 100 death notices. Stepanov turned to Captain Volkov, who stood at attention, but in whose eyes read the triumph of a victor. Report status of materiel. All machines operational, Comrade Colonel. 3 running gear damages from mines will repair in 2 hours. No hull penetrations, no personnel losses. 2 wounded, cut by brick shards when leaning out of hatches. The colonel looked once more at the mangled bed mesh welded to the turret of 341. He shook his head. Beds. You fight on beds, Volkov. If they'd reported this to me, I would have court-martialed you for damaging equipment. Before the battle. Yes, sir, the captain answered imperturbably. And now? And now, I want to see the one who thought of this. From behind the track stepped Senior Sergeant Orlov. He looked like a miner after an emergency shift. His face, a black mask cut by white streaks of sweat. Hands in oil and welding burns. He didn't snap to attention, didn't click his heels. He just stood, leaning on a sledgehammer with which he had just straightened a bent fender. Senior Sergeant Orlov, he introduced himself. His voice was hoarse, torn by shouting and smoke. Stepanov walked up to him closely. An officer in a clean greatcoat and a mechanic in burned coveralls. 2 worlds of one war. Your work? The colonel nodded at the mutilated screens. The whole company's work, Comrade Colonel. But the idea, yes. Physics of a spaced explosion. Physics, Stepanov chuckled. Where did you study, physicist? Tractor station, tractor brigade, and 3 years of practice on armor. The colonel took off his glove. Leather creaked. He extended a hand, the clean, groomed palm of a staff officer. Orlov hesitated, wiping his wide, calloused palm on his pant leg, but then firmly, man to man, shook the colonel's hand. Thank you, Sergeant. For the men, thank you. And for the machines. This handshake was worth more than a medal. It was recognition. Recognition that the dirty, makeshift truth of trench engineering turned out stronger than polished blueprints and manuals. Adjutant! Stepanov barked, not letting go of the mechanic's hand. Yes, Comrade Colonel. Write a report to Front HQ, urgent, encrypted. Based on results of fighting in Ternopil, effectiveness of makeshift anti-cumulative screens confirmed 100%. 38 hits, 0 penetrations. Recommend immediate implementation of experience in all tank units of the Army. Code name of item... Stepanov thought for a second, looking at the torn mesh. Code name... Shield M. Metallic. And add... Acquire materials on site. Anything. Weld a bold devil to it if you have to, as long as it holds distance. The protocol was dry, like an autumn leaf. It had no emotions, no description of the crew's fear and the welder's sleepless night. Only numbers and conclusions. But this sheet of paper, which in an hour would land on the front commander's desk, weighed more than a ton of shells. It changed the rules of the game. Orlov listened to the colonel dictating and felt a strange emptiness. The adrenaline was gone. Only wild, leaden fatigue remained. He looked at his machine, at this Shield M, which was actually a shield of desperation and hope. And one more thing, Stepanov turned to Volkov. Recommendation for Orlov for the Order of the Red Star, and everyone who welded for the Medal for Courage. Process it today. Yes, sir. The colonel walked on to his car, giving orders on the go about bringing up welding equipment and electrodes. The bureaucratic machine, creaking its gears, began to turn around. What yesterday was unauthorized action and property damage, today became official military doctrine. Orlov sat on the track of his tank, took out a tobacco pouch. His fingers trembled, spilling loose tobacco. "Hear that, Dmitrich?" Popov nudged him with his shoulder. "They're giving a medal. And Shield M. Sounds good, huh? Science." "Science," Orlov exhaled smoke. "Science of survival, Vanya." He looked at the hole in the screen. There, deep in the twisted metal, a drop of copper had frozen, the remnant of that very shaped charge jet that didn't reach the target. This drop was now just a cold piece of metal, harmless and dead. They had defeated it. Defeated it not with a heroic dash onto an embrasure, but with precise calculation and hard labor. Life continued around them. Crews filled tanks, loaded shells. But now there was no doom in their movements. They knew their armor could take a hit. They had seen the proof with their own eyes. 38 times death knocked on their doors, and 38 times it left with nothing. It was a victory of technology, a victory of reason over the brute force of explosives. And this protocol, which the radio operator was now tapping out to the staff car, was evidence of the birth of a new era in tank warfare. An era where a simple steel grate could mean more than millimeters of hardened armor. "All right, smoke break over." Orlov stubbed out the cigarette on his heel. "Need to weld. Sidorov's screen fell off completely, and we still have to get to the center." He picked up the stinger again. Heroism ended. Work began. The war hadn't gone anywhere, and the Germans still had plenty of Panzerfausts. But now the tankers had something to answer this challenge with. The iron cages of Ternopil became the official shield of the Red Army. Ternopil did not surrender. It died snapping back, with every window, every basement, every attic. By April 26th, the assault turned into methodical grinding of concrete and brick. Artillery took off the upper floors. Aviation leveled blocks to the ground. But in the labyrinth of first floors and ruins, the decisive word remained with armor. And this armor now looked different. An iron avalanche moved through the streets. Tanks, looking like mobile barricades, crushed resistance with their mass and invulnerability. The aesthetics of war were trampled completely. No shine, no clear silhouettes. Machines resembled piles of garbage that suddenly came to life and crawled forward, spewing fire. Torn meshes, bent grates, pieces of tin, all this shook, rattled, but securely kept the crew's lives. In panic, the Germans called this the Iron Broom. Tactics changed. If earlier tanks were afraid to enter narrow passages without tight infantry cover, now they acted more boldly. Shielded machines went first, drawing fire onto themselves. They worked like minesweepers, only instead of mines, they collected Panzerfaust shots on themselves. The mechanics of the battle on Mickiewicz Street became a classic example of the new order. 3 German grenadier teams took positions in the ruins of a pharmacy, ideal sector of fire. Distance, 30 meters. The tank exposed its flank. 3 pops of ejection charges merged into one. 3 grenades hit the homemade screens. The first tore the mesh, splashing the jet in the air. The second hit a welded sheet of roofing iron, triggering prematurely. The third hit a bracket, knocking it off, but not reaching the armor. The tank didn't even slow down. The turret slowly, with a terrible screech, turned toward the pharmacy. An 85mm high-explosive shell entered the window opening. The explosion inside the enclosed space left not even memories of the ambush. Walls collapsed, burying the shooters under tons of brick. The tank climbed over the pile of rubble and went on. This repeated time after time. On Ruskaya Street, on Market Square, near the train station, German infantry, used to one shot guaranteeing a stop to the Russian offensive, found themselves unarmed. Their main advantage, cheap and deadly cumulative weapons, was neutralized by trash from city dumps. The statistics summarized at Army HQ by the evening of each day looked anomalous. Before the screens were implemented, losses from Panzerfausts in urban battles were up to 80% of the total number of hit machines. Tanks burned like candles. Crews died entirely. After mass equipping machines with Shield M, the loss curve plummeted. 60%. The number of irreversible armored vehicle losses from handheld anti-tank grenade launchers dropped by 60%. This wasn't just a number in a report. It was the abyss between life and death. It meant that out of every 10 tanks that should have remained smoking carcasses on the streets of Ternopil, 6 continued the fight. It meant hundreds of saved lives of trained specialists. In the technical support battalion, they couldn't change screens fast enough. Tanks returned from battle stripped to the metal. Meshes hung in rags. Grates were twisted into corkscrews, angle irons torn off. But under this mangled kit, the armor remained whole. Black soot spots, dents, scratches, but not a single through burn into the fighting compartment. Not a single detonated ammo rack. Not a single mechanic burned alive. Orlov saw this result with his own eyes. He drove his machine in the vanguard, punching through to the city center. He saw German soldiers dropping useless tubes and running, realizing their magic no longer worked. The psychological fracture was scarier than physical destruction. The enemy realized his weapon didn't work. And a soldier who doesn't believe in his weapon has already lost. The finale of the assault was like the work of a giant press. Tanks with screens squeezed the remains of the garrison into a ring. They weren't afraid to get right up to buildings. They fired point-blank into basement embrasures. Iron cages welded onto armor allowed tankers to regain the aggression and pressure that fear of Faust men had taken from them. When the last pockets of resistance were suppressed, a strange, deafening silence fell. The city lay in ruins. Dust slowly settled on the cobblestones, covering everything with a gray film. The smell of burning that hung over Ternopil for weeks began to dissipate, giving way to fresh spring wind. The column stopped on the central square. Crews shut off engines. You could hear the cooling metal clicking. Men climbed out of hatches, dirty, black with soot, deadly tired, but alive. Orlov climbed onto the armor. He took off his helmet, wiped sweat from his forehead. His hands were trembling. The tension of the last 24 hours of continuous combat was taking its toll. He looked around. The whole square was packed with equipment, dozens of T-34s, and almost on every one, traces of hits. Torn holes in meshes, bent frames, scorched flanks. If not for these ridiculous structures, half of these machines would now be burning on the outskirts. Nearby, on the armor of a neighboring tank, sat a young lieutenant, a platoon commander. He was smoking, looking at a hole in his tank's screen where a grenade had entered just an hour ago. He should have died. The shaped charge jet should have burned through the side right opposite his seat, but the jet went into the void, smashing against the springs of an old sofa they had welded in a rush at night. The lieutenant was alive. He smoked, squinting at the sun and smiling. Orlov looked at these faces, hundreds of faces. Young and old, cheerful and grim. Mechanics, gunners, loaders, living people. They laughed, slapped each other on the back, drank water from flasks. They made plans for tomorrow. They wrote letters home. This was the main reward. Not the Order of the Red Star, which was already being processed at HQ, Not gratitude in the Supreme Commander's order. The reward was these living voices. Orlov understood. He hadn't created a wonder weapon that would win the war. He simply gave these guys a chance not to burn, a chance to return. He climbed down to the ground, walked to the side of his machine, ran his palm over the mangled metal of the screen. The sharp edge of a torn angle iron scratched his skin. Iron was dead, cold, rough, but it took the blow intended for living flesh. "Thank you, piece of iron," Orlov said quietly. Volkov walked up to him. The captain also looked exhausted, but in his eyes there was no longer that despair with which he looked at the map a week ago.
"See them?" The company commander nodded at the crowd of tankers. "That is your battalion, Orlov. Your personal, saved battalion. Statistically, we should have lost 12 machines today. We lost one. A track was cut. 11 crews are breathing, thanks to your stubbornness." Orlov shrugged. He felt awkward from these words. He was just a mechanic. He solved the technical problem. "It wasn't me, Comrade Captain. It's physics. And welding." "Physics," Volkov chuckled. "Let it be physics. But I'll write to my mother that I was saved by Senior Sergeant Orlov and a bed from a dormitory." In the distance, behind the ruins of the cathedral, the sun was setting. Its rays illuminated the twisted, ugly silhouettes of the Victor tanks. The iron cages of Ternopil had done their job. They took the fire onto themselves, turning the absolute evil of the Panzerfaust into a powerless flash. The experiment, born in mud and blood, became a system. The experience of this company had already flown in telegrams to all fronts. Tomorrow, in thousands of repair shops from the Baltic to the Black Sea, welding torches would light up. Thousands of mechanics would start cutting, bending, and welding, creating shields for their machines. The war continued, but now tankers had an antidote to the cumulative poison. Orlov took a crumpled pack of cigarettes from his pocket, lit up. The smoke mixed with the smell of cooling armor. He looked at his hands, rough, with ingrained oil, with black nails. These hands did what design bureaus couldn't do. They saved life. And for Senior Sergeant Orlov, that was more important than taking any city. May of 1945 brought silence. It was unusual, deafening, scarier than any cannonade. People used to sleeping under the roar of diesels and shell bursts woke up to birds singing and didn't understand where they were. The war, which had ground up millions of fates and tons of steel, stopped. Tanks shut off their engines. Hatches opened, releasing the smell of gunpowder and sweat to let in the scent of lilacs and damp spring earth. Senior Sergeant Dmitry Orlov returned home. He didn't become a general. He didn't receive the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, though many thought he deserved it more than some staff strategists. On his tunic shone the Order of the Red Star and the Medal for Courage, the standard set for a surviving veteran. Orlov took off his shoulder boards, hung his tunic in the closet, and put on old, oily coveralls. He returned to where he came from, to the machine tractor station. His post-war life was quiet. He rebuilt engines again, straightened plows, welded frames for cedars. No one at the collective farm really knew that this silent, unsmiling man with hands eternally black from oil had revolutionized armored warfare. To neighbors, he was just a good mechanic who could fix any mechanism using a sledgehammer and a strong word. Orlov didn't write memoirs. He didn't speak at schools with stories of exploits. He generally didn't like remembering Ternopil. For him, those days were not a heroic epic, but hard, dirty work where death stood behind his back and breathed the smell of carbide down his neck.
He just wanted to forget that ringing sound a shaped charge jet makes hitting steel, and that smell of burnt meat that haunted his nightmares. But the history of technology remembers everything. The tanks that stormed Ternopil were cleaned up after the victory. The ugly grates were cut off, seams ground down, painted in parade green. On pedestals and in museums, T-34s had to look beautiful, sleek, heroic. Rusty beds and cemetery fences didn't fit the aesthetics of the Victory March. They were scrapped, melted down into new tractors and pots. It seemed the experiment was forgotten, but in secret proving ground reports, in closed manuals for engineers, the blueprints remained. Shield M, that's what it was called in documents. Dry diagrams, penetration tables, welding recommendations. Military science gritting its teeth admitted, the sergeant major's makeshift invention turned out more effective than many academic developments. Decades passed. The world changed. Tanks became more complex, faster, deadlier. Armor became multi-layered, composite, reactive. Electronics, laser rangefinders, satellite navigation appeared. But death didn't stand still either. Replacing the primitive German Panzerfaust came handheld anti-tank grenade launchers of a new generation. RPG-7, disposable flies, ATGMs. The principle remained the same: a shaped charge cone, focus, a plasma jet burning through any thickness. And then engineers remembered Orlov. In local conflicts of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, from the mountains of Afghanistan to the deserts of the Middle East, grates began to be welded onto armor again. First, again makeshift, by crews from rebar and chain-link fence. Then, factory-made. Look at a modern tank or armored personnel carrier. On almost every machine, you will see these strange lattice structures girdling the flanks and rear. In professional language, this is called anti-cumulative bar armor, or slat armor. Elegant, computer-calculated, made of special alloys. But if you look closely, you can unmistakably recognize that same rough bedspring mesh welded in the dark from garbage. Dmitry Orlov didn't become a famous designer like Koshkin or Morozov. His name isn't on tank names, but his legacy lives in every weld seam of these grates. It lives in thousands of soldiers who returned home from hotspots because a grenade flying at their APC got stuck between steel bars and didn't trigger, or triggered early, splashing its fury in the air. Orlov died quietly in the mid-80s. There were few people at his funeral. Ordinary send-off for an ordinary pensioner. No one fired a salute. No one gave pompous speeches about saving tank armadas. But among those walking behind the coffin were several old men with military bearing. They weren't his relatives. They were those very lieutenants and sergeants from 1944, those who survived Ternopil thanks to his iron cages. Each of them had children after the war, then grandchildren. Now great-grandchildren are growing up. Hundreds, thousands of people who shouldn't have been in the world. They should have disappeared in April 1944, turning into ash inside burning tanks. But they live, go to work, fall in love, build houses. This is the real monument to the engineer. Not a granite slab on a square, but a living chain of generations preserved thanks to a simple idea. Thanks to the understanding that sometimes 30 centimeters of empty space are more important than half a meter of armor. War is always a competition between sword and shield. The sword gets sharper, the shield stronger. But in this eternal race of technologies, there is always room for the human factor, for ingenuity, for that special state of mind when a man cornered takes a piece of rusty iron in his hands and tells death, "No, not today." The story of the iron cages of Ternopil isn't just an episode of the Great Patriotic War. It is a lesson. A lesson that salvation doesn't always come from above, in the form of an order or new equipment. Often salvation lies under your feet, on the dump of history. You just need to have eyes to see the solution and hands to embody it in metal. Today, when you see footage from combat zones in the news, pay attention to the tanks. Look at these grates. It isn't just protection. It's a hello from Sergeant Major Orlov. It is his hand, extended through time, to cover the flank of another machine. An invention born in the mud, blood, and despair of urban combat became a standard of the global military industry. A simple steel mesh. Primitive, cheap, ugly. But it proves one simple truth time after time. In war, nothing is more expensive than life, and nothing is more effective than physics multiplied by the desire to survive. Orlov defeated the German Panzerfaust not with the force of a weapon, but with the force of thought. He turned the tank's weakness into its strength, and as long as shaped charge projectiles exist, these grates will stand on the armor, eternal sentinels guarding the silence inside the fighting compartment. Silence that means life.